Hello class, and welcome to another section of the Great Texts Hour. Today we're going to talk about Book 1 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And I wish I could ask you all in person what you thought of Aristotle, having now read Plato's Republic. I would be curious to know whether you liked Aristotle better or Plato better. Some people prefer Aristotle's clarity. Other people prefer Plato's dramatic writing style. There really is no right answer to the question. It is personal preference. Although I would point out we are comparing apples and oranges because we're comparing a Platonic dialogue to an Aristotelian treatise. Aristotle actually did write dialogues as well. Unfortunately, none of them have survived. So it would be wonderful to see how the two would compare. But basically the way to think about the difference between Plato and Aristotle, yes, they did have some philosophical differences, but think of Plato as sort of the genius founder of a new company. It really is Plato who is putting philosophy on the map, carving a niche for it in society. And he was largely successful in a weird way, in a way in which Socrates was not. Plato was able to, through his writings, make philosophy tolerable to the rest of society. Aristotle is banking off that. He's building on it and sort of bringing things to the next level by being a little more clear about things, by answering certain questions that were left unanswered in a Platonic dialogue. So it's not that there are two competing systems, although there are some differences, but I think there's also a lot of continuity as well. So keep that in mind. And final biographical note about Aristotle, obviously he is Plato's disciple, just as Plato was Socrates' disciple. So we're seeing some continuity. Regarding Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, we're going to divide our lecture into three parts, although it really is one seamless garment. We're going to talk about the science of ethics, and then we're going to talk about what is happiness, and then we're going to talk a little about virtue. So let's start with the science of ethics. Aristotle starts his book by saying, hey, what is this book all about? And his answer to that question is the content of Book 1. What is this book all about? It is about the science of ethics. And Aristotle takes these words very seriously. So let's first start with what we mean about the science of ethics. What he means is that ethics is not some field that you make up, that you just sort of, you have your system of ethics, I have my system of ethics, and no one can say which system is right. Aristotle says, yes, you can. It's a science. In other words, it is an episteme. That is the Greek word for knowledge. That's the thing that Socrates was seeking in all of his philosophical investigations. Not opinion, knowledge. And Aristotle is making the claim that ethics can give you honest to goodness knowledge about right and wrong, about good and evil, because it is a knowledge grounded in physis, nature. We are going to discover the nature of the good in the science of ethics. And we're going to understand what is good and what is evil, what is right and what is wrong. This is an objective science. Now, it's not an empirical science, it's not biology or chemistry or whatever, but it is a science nonetheless, because it's knowledge, real knowledge. And because it is a science, like any other science, it's going to have a method. And this method, Aristotle describes it in terms of the image of a racetrack. We're going to use slightly different language in this class. It's the difference between what later in Latin is called the prius quo ad nos versus the prius quoad se, which literally means what is first according to us versus what is first according to itself, what is first in and of itself. Prius means first, but I put it in parentheses because for short, we basically talk about the quoad nos versus the quoad se. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is there is a difference between how a thing initially appears to us and what the thing truly is. So for example, I wake up in the morning, I do not feel the earth move beneath my feet, but I look into the eastern horizon of the sky, I see the sun. And then during the course of the day, I see the sun at different points in the sky, and then eventually I see it sink into the western horizon. So quoad nos, how the thing initially looks to me, it looks like the sun is moving around the earth. But quoad se, what the thing is in and of itself, is the opposite. It is the earth that's moving around the sun. There is a difference between the quoad nos and the quoad se, how the thing initially looks to us and what the thing is in and of itself. Now, just because in the example I gave, the quoad nos turned out to be false, that doesn't mean the quoad nos is bad. The quoad nos is all the data that we initially receive from our senses in order to move to intelligible realities. So think of this in terms of Plato and the sensible versus the intelligible. So coming back to the example of the sun, Galileo started with the quoad nos. That is to say, he started with the same sensible data that all of us start with. He was just a little more perceptive in understanding the implications of that data, which enabled him to move from how the thing initially looks to us, geocentrism, to what is actually going on in and of itself, heliocentrism. So Aristotle says that's what we're going to do with ethics. We're going to start with the quoad nos and we're going to move to the quoad se. And in the case of ethics, the quoad nos is, what do people say the good is? What do people say right and wrong is? Let's not reject all opinion radically, but let's listen to people. Let's hear what they have to say. We'll receive their opinions. We'll kick the tires. We'll look under the hood. We'll give it a test drive, and we'll see how good this opinion is. And hence, we will move, just like Socrates, from opinion to knowledge. We will move from how the thing appears to us, our opinion about it, to what the thing truly is, the knowledge of the thing. So his move from the quoad nos to the quoad se is very similar to the move from opinion to knowledge that we saw in Plato. It is a science, it aims at knowledge, it has a method, and it has its own degree of precision. It is a science, but every science has its own level of precision. Do not expect the same degree of precision in ethics that you get in, say, chemistry. The example that Aristotle gives is both geometers and carpenters use a right angle. But carpenters do not have the same degree of precision with their right angles that geometers do. And that's okay. If you try to impose this geometrical expectation of a right angle in carpentry, you would go insane, because you can't get that same level of precision with a right angle in carpentry that you have in geometry. Why not? Because of the subject matter. Every subject matter admits its own level of precision. And the subject of wood does not allow you to be as precise as you can with thinking geometrical theorems. Man, which is the subject of ethics, is a messy creature. He lives in a world where there are many extenuating circumstances, many shades of gray, many things to be taken into consideration. So we can know the difference between right and wrong. We can know good and evil, but do not expect absolute precision about ethical dilemmas every single time. It ain't going to happen. So it is a science, but it is not going to be a hyper-precise science, and that's okay. Notice how intellectually honest Aristotle is about these things. So it is a science, and it is the science that concerns ethics. Now, I've already used ethics as synonymous with knowing good and evil, right versus wrong, morality. But let me mention a couple of other things that Aristotle mentions. The first is he considers ethics as a subdivision of the master art of politics. And the significance of this is not that you subordinate everything to the state. That's not what he's saying here. But what he's saying is that man is a political animal. By nature, we are designed to live in community with each other. And ethics is concerned with that. So it is about my individual pursuit of moral excellence, but that always takes place in a political context, and we cannot forget that. The second thing that he talks about is that ethics concerns the good of man qua man. Qua is another one of those Latin philosophical terms. It simply means as. So what does it mean to talk about the good of man as man? Well, what he's saying there is there's a difference between what is the good of a human being and what is the good of certain activities or identities of a human being. It's easy to answer the question, what is the good of a doctor? The good of a doctor is the fact that he can heal bodies. What is a good lawyer? A good lawyer is someone who knows the law and can successfully defend his client. And so you can go down the line, right? What is a good husband? What is a good student? Ethics answers the question, what is a good human being? What does a good human being look like? And what good does he pursue in order to be a good human being? I understand what I need to do in order to advance my career. What do I need to do in order to advance my happiness? My perfection, not as a professional, but my perfection as a human being. That's the question that ethics answers. And the reason why it's interested in this question is that ethics is about happiness. We'll get to the definition of happiness in a moment. But isn't it interesting how very different this whole map is from the way we think about things today? First of all, we don't think of ethics as a science. That is why when morality and moral issues come up today, have you noticed this? We don't talk about objective things like virtue or right or wrong. We talk instead about values. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with values, but notice it's very subjective values. That is why there's no such thing as values with a capital V. It's always the values of a certain group. Family values, corporate values, American values, and what have you. Because the value is only valued by a particular group, and it doesn't necessarily mean that their evaluation is grounded in objective reality. So when we think of values, we're using a very subjective framework. Aristotle says, no, you can do better. You can actually have an objective knowledge of these things. Also, with respect to ethics, we often don't think of ethics in terms of happiness anymore. When moral issues come up, we often think, what is the bare minimum I have to do in order to be considered a good human being? right? How can I be good by the skin of my teeth? We think of goodness as something we grudgingly have to do, kind of like Gaiji's ring. And we don't really think of it as connected to our happiness. It's a duty. It's almost like a necessary evil, doing good, but it's not something we really have our heart in. Aristotle is saying the only path to happiness is by being a good human being. We are interested in ethics because we are interested in happiness. That's what it means to be a good human being, is ultimately to be a happy human being. Aristotle's next task is to answer the question, what is happiness? This is obviously an extremely important question for us human beings. Happiness occupies a unique position in our lives. It is the only thing for which we do everything else. Aristotle has an interesting way of describing that. He says happiness is a useless activity. That is to say, we don't pursue happiness because it is useful. When something is useful, you pursue it so that you can get to something else. It has a use. It's a means to an end. Happiness is not a means to an end. Happiness is the end. Happiness is the goal of human life. Every single one of us, without exception, wants to be happy. And everything we do in our lives is for the sake of our happiness. The problem, of course, is that not everyone makes the right decisions that makes them happy. So, first thing we got to do is figure out what is the nature of happiness. Once we can properly identify the goal, we have a better chance of reaching that goal. We need to know what our target is. And so Aristotle gives us a definition of happiness. Happiness, he says, is an activity of the soul in conformity with virtue over a complete lifetime. Let's break that down a little bit. Happiness is an activity of the soul. It is not primarily an activity of the body. Of course, your body is going to be involved in your activities as a human being, your moral activities, but it's not physical excellence. It's not bodily excellence. It's an excellence of the soul. It is first and foremost something that the soul does. And whatever it does in conformity with virtue. Remember, as we've seen in this class, that virtue is synonymous with excellence in Greek. Arete means both virtue and excellence. Whatever happiness is, it is excellent. It is the soul at its very best, the soul at its very finest. It is the soul fully alive. And not just now and then, not just once in a while, but over a complete lifetime. Aristotle has that chilling line, "Call no man happy until he's dead," which is kind of ironic, but what he's getting at is happiness is something that has to be consistently pursued and consistently attained. So he says, for example, if a child sadly dies young, we cannot call them happy because they have not built up the habits of happiness. Conversely, someone in old age who suddenly goes off the rails and becomes bad, we cannot call them happy either. Happiness is a consistently performed state of mind that is done over a lifetime. Notice one implication of this definition of happiness, and I know this rubs us the wrong way. We don't think about happiness in these terms, but what it means is happiness is not an emotion. Happiness is not a feeling. Happiness is not joy. It's not an emotion, it's a state of being. it's a state of mind. That means the happy man is actually happy even during times of stress, even during times of sorrow, because he has this consistent orientation towards the good, whether he's feeling elated about it or not. Happiness is a permanent condition, not a transitory feeling. There is one other aspect to this definition that needs further exploration. Happiness is an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence over a complete lifetime. The next question is, what does an excellent soul look like? Virtue is a perfection of the soul. What perfections of the soul are there? And that is the next thing that Aristotle answers. So happiness consists of a perfected soul, a soul that is excellent. But the next question is, what is the soul? What is the human soul, and in what ways does it become perfect? For Aristotle, the soul is the principle of all life. That means that anything that lives has a soul. The soul is defined as that which gives life to the body. Plants have souls. Animals have souls. The only difference between the souls of plants and animals and human beings is that humans have immortal souls, souls that can live forever because they are endowed with something extra, the faculty of reason. But just because plants and animals are not immortal does not mean they don't have souls. The Latin word anima is where we get the word animal. What is an animal? It is an ensouled creature. But the soul is a very complicated thing. We saw this in Socrates and in Plato as well. Aristotle divides his soul up a little differently, draws a different map, but ultimately I think the two are compatible. So let's start at the bottom and work our way up. Aristotle, first of all, divides the soul into two basic parts, the rational and the irrational. The rational is simply the gift of reason. The irrational does not mean irrational in the way that we use that word today, that it's something that is against reason, that it is unreasonable. What he simply means here is that it is not reason. It is somehow unresponsive to reason. It doesn't necessarily behave irrationally, but it is not responsive to my particular reason. For example, the vegetative part of the soul is the part of the soul that our souls have in common with all living life, plants and animals. And it is completely unresponsive to my reason. It is simply the principle of life. It's responsible for the growth of my hair and fingernails. It's responsible for the beating of my heart and the circulation of my blood. It's responsible for cellular activity. And thanks be to God, these things are constantly going on, thanks to the soul. But my reason cannot necessarily control that. I can't tell my hair and fingernails, stop growing. Appetites and emotions, on the other hand, are partially responsive to reason. Notice, just as we have the vegetative part of our soul in common with all plants and animals, we have our appetites and emotions in common with animals. Animals get hungry and thirsty and tired. Animals have emotions. They can experience joy or fear or anger. We have that in common with the animal kingdom. And these appetites and emotions are partially responsive to reason. That is to say, not totally responsive. I can't make them go away with the wave of a magic wand. I can't stop the appetite of hunger, except maybe by feeding it. But I can't say, wait, one morning, I'm really sick of being hungry. Every day I wake up and I'm hungry. Well, you know what? No more. Hunger, stop. It doesn't work that way. But what you can do is control your anger. You can control your anger. You can control your hunger as well. You can partially control your appetites and emotions. You can tame them. You may not be able to eliminate them, but you can tame them to some extent. Then we get to the realm of reason. And like Socrates, Aristotle divides reason into two different capacities. Remember, Socrates divided reason into calculating and contemplating. The calculating was sort of the problem-solving, practical part of the soul, whereas the contemplating part of the soul was the part of the soul that learned and discovered eternal truths, that got outside the cave. And Aristotle calls each of those two different parts the practical and the theoretical. By theoretical, he doesn't mean hypothetical or conjectural. Theoria literally means seeing in Greek. We actually get the word theater from that, because what do you do when you go to the theater? You see it all. You take it all in. You soak it all up. And that's what you do when you get outside the cave. When you're engaged in theoria, you're not trying to figure out practical solutions to problems. You're just soaking it up. You are contemplating. And our reason is capable of both of these things. We have a practical intellect and a theoretical intellect. That is how amazing our reason is. So remember, the soul has this terrain, and virtue is a perfection of some part of the soul. So now we got to figure out which of these things can be perfected by virtue. So let's start at the bottom and work our way up. Can the vegetative part of our soul be perfected by virtue? Aristotle would say no, because it's completely unresponsive to reason. There is no virtuous growth of your fingernails. There is no virtuous growth of your hair. It simply is what it is. Your appetites and emotions, on the other hand, since they can be partially controlled by reason, can be perfected. And we call the perfection of appetites and emotions moral virtues. What about the intellect? Can your intellect be perfected by virtue? You bet it can. But that's a different thing than perfecting appetites and emotions. So it's going to be a different kind of virtue. And Aristotle refers to that as intellectual virtues. Intellectual virtues perfect, wait for it, the intellect. Moral virtues perfect your mores, your practices, your emotions, your reactions to life around you. So Aristotle has given us this map, and now he's going to talk about each of these things. In Book 2, he's going to talk about moral virtues, and he's going to give us a lot of different moral virtues, for there are many ways to perfect your appetites and emotions. And then he's going to go on to talk about intellectual virtues. He's a very clear and consistent writer.